Chapter 20. The next 5 days our trail led us through the country that John had traveled. The 5th day brought us to the village where our horses were waiting for us. Here Emil met us, and from this time on the traveling was comparatively easy to the village where Emil lived. As we neared this village we could see that the country was more thickly populated and the roads and trails were far better than any we had traveled. Our way led along the fertile valley, and we were following this valley to what happened to be a level plateau. We noticed that the valley was gradually getting narrower as we went on, and at last the walls came in so close on each side of the stream that they formed a canyon. About 4 o'clock of the day we reached the village. We came suddenly to a perpendicular bluff over which the stream fell in a drop of about 300 feet. The road led to a level place at the foot of the cliff, near the falls. We found that there was an opening cut in the sandstone on an angle of 45 degrees to the plateau above, and steps had been hewn in the floor of the upraise so that the ascent was an easy one. Great stone doors had been so arranged that they could be closed into the opening at the foot of the cliff, thus presenting a formidable barrier to an intruding foe. When we reached the plateau above, we found the stairway up the incline was the only means of egress or ingress that the creek afforded. At one time there had been 3 means of access, but the walls that surrounded the village had now been rebuilt in such a way as to bar all possible access. A great many houses in the village were built so that one wall formed a part of the wall that surrounded the village. We noted that, when the houses formed part of the wall, these houses were usually 3 stories high, and there were no openings for windows in the wall until the 3rd story was reached. At every opening a balcony was built large enough for 2 or 3 people to stand upon comfortably. These, we judged, were arranged so that a lookout could be kept at all times. We were told the district was once inhabited by a native tribe that isolated themselves from the others until as a tribe they had disappeared, a few having been assimilated by the other tribes. This was Emil's home and the place where we were to meet the members of our party, who had divided into small groups in order to cover more territory. Upon inquiry we found we were the first to arrive and that the others would be in the next day. We were assigned to one of the houses built into the wall of the village. The windows of the 3rd story looked out over the rugged mountainous country to the south. We were made comfortable and were told that supper would be served on the 1st, or ground floor. We went down and found Emil, his sister, her husband, and the son and daughter that we had met at the temple a few days before, seated at the table. We had no sooner finished supper than we heard a commotion in the little square which the house faced. One of the villagers came in and announced that our chief and his party had arrived. They were made comfortable, then we all proceeded to the roof. The sun had gone down but the afterglow still lingered. The view we looked out upon resembled a large basin at the confluence of a number of streams coming down in deep gorges from the higher mountains. These streams all entered the larger stream before it flowed over the steep wall of rocks into the valley below, thus forming the waterfall. This larger stream emerged from a deep canyon and ran over the level plateau but a few hundred feet before it plunged over the precipice. A number of smaller streams flowed over the perpendicular walls of the canyon cut by the larger stream, forming perpendicular falls and in some cases, roaring torrents. Some fell in sheer drops of 1 to 200 feet, while others had cut their way into the canyon wall and fell in a succession of cataracts. Far up in the mountains the gulches were filled with glaciers, and these glaciers projected like giant fingers from the great snowcap that covered the top of the entire range. The wall to protect the village had been joined to that of the larger gorge where it jutted out upon the level plain, then ran out to the cliff where the water dropped into the valley below. Where this wall joined the wall of the gorge the mountain rose perpendicular for 2,000 feet, thus creating a natural barrier as far as the eye could see. We were told that the level plateau extended for 60 miles east and west, and in some places was 30 miles north and south, and the only other means of access was at the widest part of the plateau where a trail led over a pass, and this pass was guarded by a wall similar to the one where we were. While we were talking over the advantages of the location for defense, Emil's sister and her daughter joined us, and a little later Emil, his sister's husband and son, came up. We noticed an undercurrent of excitement and were soon told by Emil's sister that they expected a visit from their mother that evening. She said, "We are so happy that we can hardly contain ourselves, for we do love mother so." We love all that have gone on to the higher attainments very dearly, for they are so fine and noble, and helpful, but our own mother is so sweet and adorable, so helpful and loving, we cannot help loving her 1,000 times more. Besides, we are of her flesh and blood. We know you will love her as we do. We asked whether she came often. The reply was, oh yes, she always comes when we need her, but she is so taken up with her work that she comes only twice a year of her own accord, and this is one of her semi-annual visits. She is to stay a week this time, and we are all so happy we scarcely know what to do. Here the talk drifted to experiences of our associates while we were separated, and we were deep in this discussion when, suddenly, stillness came over all, and almost before we realized it we were sitting perfectly silent, without a suggestion from anyone. The evening shadows had gathered until the far-off mountain snowcap looked like a great white monster just ready to loose its icy fingers and reach out over the valley below. From the stillness came a gentle swish like that of a bird alighting, and it seemed as though a slight mist were gathering on the eastern parapet. The mist suddenly took form, and there stood a woman, wondrously beautiful in face and form, with an intense radiant light about her that we could scarcely look upon. The family started to their feet and advanced rapidly toward her with outstretched arms, exclaiming, "Mother," almost as one voice. She stepped lightly down from the parapet to the roof and embraced each as any fond mother would, then was introduced to us. She said, "Oh, you are the dear brothers from faraway America that have come to visit us. I certainly am overjoyed to welcome you to our land. Our hearts go out to all, and we feel that if they would only let us, we would just put our arms out and embrace all as I have embraced these I call mine, just now. For we are in reality one family, sons of the one Father Mother God. Why can we not all meet as brothers?" We had remarked just before that the evenings were growing chilly, but when this lady appeared the warmth emitted from her presence made the evening seem like that of midsummer. The air seemed laden with the perfume of flowers, a light like that of the full moon seemed to pervade everything, and there was a warmth and glow over all that I cannot describe. Yet there was no hint of display, just that deep, simple, kindly, childlike way. It was suggested that we go below, and the mother with the other ladies led the way to the stairs, with our party following and the men of the household bringing up the rear. Then we noticed that, although we seemed to be walking in the usual way, our feet made no sound upon the roof or the stairs. We were not trying to go quietly, in fact, one of our party said he deliberately tried to make a noise and could not. It did not seem as if our feet came in contact with the roof or stairs. We went into a beautifully furnished room. As soon as we entered and were seated we noticed a warmth and glow, and the room was filled with a soft light that none of us could explain. All maintained a deep silence for a time. The mother asked if we were comfortably located and cared for, and if we were enjoying our trip. The talk led to general everyday subjects, and she seemed familiar with them all. The talk then led to our home life, and the mother gave us the given names of fathers, mothers, sisters and brothers, and we were surprised at the detailed description of each of our lives that she gave without asking us one question. She told us the countries we had visited, the work we had accomplished, and where we had failed. This was not told in a vague way that we would be obliged to piece together, but every detail stood out as plainly as if we were living the scenes over again. After our friends bade us good night, we could but wonder, when we realized that not one of them was less than 100 years old, and the mother was over 700 years, and 600 of that time she had lived on earth with her physical body. Yet all were as buoyant and light-hearted as though they had been 20, and nothing was assumed. It was as though youthful people were with us. Before they departed that evening we were told there would be quite an assembly in the lodge the next evening, and that we were all invited to be present. Chapter 21. Before noon of the next day all of the parties had arrived. We spent the afternoon in comparing notes, and these notes checked to the letter. That evening, after we had finished with our notes, we were invited to go directly to the lodge for dinner. When we arrived we found about 300 people, men, women, and children, assembled and seated at long banquet tables. They had reserved places for us at one of the end tables so we could look down the whole length of the room. The tables were all covered with beautiful white linen and set with china and silver plate as for a real banquet, yet there was but one dim light burning in the hall. After we had been seated for perhaps 20 minutes, there was a deep stillness, and in a moment a pale light flooded the room. The light grew stronger and stronger until all the room was aglow and everything in the room sparkled as if thousands of incandescent lamps had been cunningly hidden and turned on gradually until all were fully lighted. We were to learn afterwards that there were no electric lights in the village. After the light came on, the stillness lasted for about 15 minutes, then of a sudden, a mist seemed to gather and there was the same gentle swish like the sound of wings that we had heard the evening before when Emil's mother appeared before us. The mist cleared and standing in the room at different points were Emil's mother and 11 others, 9 men and 3 women. Words fail to describe the radiant beauty of that scene. When I say that, although they had no wings, they appeared like a troop of angels, I am not exaggerating. They stood for an instant as if transfixed. All bowed their heads and waited. In a moment there came music from unseen voices. I had heard of heavenly voices but I had never experienced them until that night. We were fairly lifted from our seats. Toward the close those that had appeared walked to their seats and we again noticed that, though they made no effort to walk quietly, their feet did not make the slightest noise. When the 12 were seated in their respective places the same mist appeared again and when it cleared there stood 12 more. This time there were 11 men and 1 woman and among these was our friend of the records. As they stood there for a moment another song burst forth. When the song was nearly ended the 12 walked to their respective places without the slightest noise. They were no sooner seated than the haze again filled the room. When it had cleared there were 13 standing, this time across the far end of the hall, 6 men and 7 women, 3 men and 3 women on each side of the woman in the center. The center one appeared to be a beautiful girl in her teens. We had thought every woman that appeared was very beautiful but this one surpassed them all. They stood with bowed heads for a moment and the music again burst forth. This music floated out for a moment then the choir of voices began. We arose to our feet. As the tones rolled on, it seemed as though we could see thousands of mystical forms moving about the singing as with one voice and through it all there was not one sad refrain, not one minor key. All was a joyous, free burst of music that came from the soul and touched the soul, lifting it up and up until we felt as if we were losing all contact with the earth. As the singing ceased, the 13 walked to their respective places and were seated. Our eyes were fairly glued on the central figure as she advanced toward our table, with a lady on either side. She was seated at the head of our table. As she sat down, the places were quietly stacked at her left hand. The lights grew dim for a moment and around each one of the 37 there was that same light that so puzzled us and the most beautiful circle of light just above the head of our honored guest. We were the only ones in that assembly that were greatly moved. Those assembled with us seemed to take it as a matter of course. After all were seated, the silence was maintained for a time, then every voice in the room burst forth in a glad, free chant led by the 37 that had appeared. When this was finished, the lady at the head of our table arose and held out her hands. On them appeared a small loaf of bread about 2 inches square and about 14 inches long. Then each one of the other 36 arose, came forward, and received a similar loaf from her hands. They passed around to all the tables and gave to each one a portion of the bread. Our Lady passed around and gave each one a portion of her loaf. As she handed each of us our portion she said, "Know ye not that Christ dwells within you and in all? Know ye not that your body is pure, perfect, young, ever beautiful, divine? Know ye not that God created you in exact image and likeness of himself and gave you dominion over all things? You, of yourself, are always Christ, the perfect Son of God, the only begotten Son of God, in whom the Father-Mother is well pleased. You are pure, perfect, holy, divine, one with God, all good, and each and every child has a right to claim this sonship, this divinity." When all had been given a portion, she returned to her seat and the loaf was the same length and size as it was when she broke the first portion from it. After this ceremony was over, the edibles began to arrive. They came in large covered containers. These containers just appeared on the table before the lady as if they were placed there by unseen hands. She lifted the lids, set them aside, and began serving. As served, the plates were passed, first one to the lady on the right, then one to the lady on the left, and they in turn passed them on until all were served generously. The meal had not progressed far when our chief asked the lady what she considered the greatest attribute of God. Without a moment's hesitation she answered, "Love." Then she went on to say, the tree of life is located in the midst of the paradise of God, the very depth of our own soul, and the rich, abundant fruit that grows and ripens to the fullest perfection, the most perfect and life-giving, is love. Love has been defined by those who perceive its true character as the greatest thing in the world. I might add that it is the greatest thing in the world. I might add that it is the greatest healing force in the world. Love never fails to meet every demand of the human heart. The divine principle of love may be used to eliminate every sorrow, every infirmity, every harsh condition, and every lack that harasses humanity. With the right understanding and use of the subtle and illimitable influence of love, the world may be healed of its wounds and the sweet mantle of its heavenly compassion may cover all inharmony, all ignorance, and all mistakes of mankind. With wings outstretched, love searches out the arid spots of the human heart, the waste places of life, and with seeming magic touch redeems humanity and transforms the world. Love is God, eternal, limitless, changeless, going beyond all visions into infinitude. The end we can only envision. Love fulfills the law of its own, consummates its perfect work, and reveals the Christ within the soul of man. Love is ever seeking an inlet whereby it may flow forth into the soul of man and pour itself out as all good to him. If it is not disturbed by man's perversity and discordant thinking, God's eternal, changeless current of love flows ever onward, carrying before it, into the great universal sea of forgetfulness, every appearance of inharmony or ugliness which disturbs the peace of man. Love is the perfect fruit of the Spirit, it goes forth, binding up the wounds of humanity, drawing nations into closer harmony, and bringing peace and prosperity to the world. It is the very pulse of the world, the heartbeat of the universe. Humanity must be charged with this current of love from the great omnipresent life if it would do the works of Jesus. Does life press heavily upon you? Do you need courage and strength to meet the problems that confront you? Are you sick or afraid? If so, lift your heart and pray to Him who leads the way. The imperishable love of God enfolds you. You need not fear. Did He not say, "Before they call I will answer and while they are yet speaking I will hear"? Approach this throne of grace boldly, not as you have thought of beseeching and groveling attitude, but with the prayer of understanding faith, knowing that the help you stand in need of is already yours. Never doubt. Do more, ask. Claim your birthright as the child of the living God, as Jesus did. Know that in the invisible, universal substance, in which we all live and move and have our being, is every good and perfect thing that man can desire, waiting to be drawn forth by faith into visible form or manifestation. Read in your own great book what Paul says of love in 1 Corinthians, chapter 13, using the word, "love," instead of charity, as was intended. Consider Solomon, when in the night of his experience he allowed his radiant love nature to expand to that universal plane of consciousness where he asked to be of service and not for self. This brought to him wealth untold and added to this was life and honor beyond his power to ask. He recognized the wisdom of love and love released its boundless wealth upon him. Silver was counted as naught in the days of Solomon. Even the drinking vessels of this mighty king of love were of pure gold. To love is to release God's unlimited storehouse of golden treasure. If we love we cannot help giving, and to give is to gain, and the law of love is fulfilled. Then, by giving, we set in operation the unfailing law of measure for measure. With no thought of receiving, it is impossible to avoid receiving, for the abundance you have given is returned to you in fulfillment of the law. Give and it shall be given unto you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, shall men give unto your bosom. For with the same measure that you meet, withal, it shall be measured to you again. If we work in the spirit of love, we must have God present in consciousness. To be one with life, love, and wisdom, is to consciously contact. To consciously contact God is to have abundance pressed upon us the same as abundance of food has been pressed upon us tonight. You see there is an abundance for all and none need want in the presence of God's abundance. This thought of abundance must lift the mind far beyond the bounds of limitation. To conceive abundance, one must relinquish all thoughts of things in particular. This concept is so large that it will not permit the thought of detail. To hold it in mind, consciousness must swing far out into the universal and revel in the joyousness of perfect freedom. This freedom must, however, not be taken for license, for we are held responsible for every thought, every act. Our consciousness cannot attain to this freedom in an instant. The breaking of the last vestige of limitation may be accomplished in an instant, but the preparation for the glorious event has gone before. The preparation in minutest detail has been accomplished from within, just as every petal of a flower is perfected in every detail within the bud. When the perfection is complete, the bud bursts its supple shell and the flower comes forth beautiful. Just so man must break the shell of self before he can come forth. God's laws are changeless, the same as they have ever been. While they are immutable, they are beneficent, for they are good. When we live in conformity to them, they become the very foundation stones on which we build our health, our happiness, our peace and poise, our success and attainment. If we abide fully in God's law, no evil can befall us. We do not need to be healed. We are every whit whole. How well we realize that in the great heart of humanity there is a deep homesickness which never can be satisfied with anything less than a clear consciousness or understanding of God, our Father. We recognize this hunger as heart's cry after God. There is nothing the human soul so longs for as to know God, whom to know aright as life eternal. We see people ever shifting from one thing to another, hoping they will find satisfaction or rest in some accomplishment or in the possession of some limited, mortal desire. We see them pursuing and gaining these things only to find themselves still unsatisfied. Some fancy they want houses and lands, some great wealth, and some great learning. We are privileged to know that man has all these things within himself. Jesus, the great Master, attempted to have all see this. How we do love him. He stands out so beautifully triumphant because of his attainments. We love all who have reached the heights or high places in consciousness that Jesus has. We not only love them for their attainments but because of what they really are. Jesus never allowed himself to dwell in the external after his illumination. He always kept his thoughts at the central part of his being, which is the Christ. In Jesus, the Christ or central spark which is God in us all, living in everyone today, was drawn forth to show itself perfectly ruling the material body or flesh man. It is in this way that he did all his mighty works, not because he was in some way different from you. He had no greater power than all have today. He was not in some way a son of God and we only servants of God. He did these works because this same divine spark, which the Father has implanted in every child born, was fanned into a brighter flame by his own efforts in holding himself in conscious communion with God himself, the source of all life, love, and power. Jesus was a man the same as all men are today. He suffered, was tempted and tried, just as you suffer because of temptation and trials. We know that during his residence on earth in the visible body Jesus spent hours of every day alone with God, and we know that, in his early manhood, he went through just what we have gone through and what you are going through today. We know that every man must overcome the mortal, the fleshly desires, the doubts and fears, until he comes to the perfect consciousness or recognition of the indwelling presence, this Father in me, to whom Jesus ascribed the credit of all his mighty works. He had to learn as we had to learn and as you are learning today. He was obliged to try over and over again as you are doing. He was obliged to hold fast as you are obliged to hold fast today, even with clenched fist and set teeth and saying, I will succeed, I do know the Christ lives within me. We recognize that it was the Christ within which made Jesus what he was, and is today, and that the same attainments are for all. In all this we would in no way detract from Jesus, for we love him with a love unspeakable. We know he went through the perfect crucifixion of self that he might lead his people to God, that he might show them the way out of sin, sickness, and trouble, that they might manifest the Father in them, that he might teach all that the same Father lives in all and loves all. None that follow Jesus' life and teaching closely can help but love him. He is our perfect elder brother. But if we sell our birthright, if we disregard or treat with contempt the beneficent laws of God, and by so doing turn our backs on the Father's house and wander into a far country, as did the prodigal son, of what avail is the peace and plenty, the abundance of warmth and cheer that abides within the house? When you are tired of the husks of life, when you are weary and homesick, with faltering steps you may retrace your way home to the Father's house. This may be done over the road of bitter experience or by a joyful letting go of all material things. It does not matter how the understanding and knowledge is gained, you will eventually press on toward the mark of your high calling. With each step you will grow strong and bolder until you will no longer falter nor hesitate. You will look within you for your illumination, then in your awakened consciousness you will realize that home is here. It is the divine omnipresence in which we all live, move, and have our being. We breathe it with every breath. We live it with every heartbeat. Do not think you must come to us. Go into your own home, your church, your house of prayer, alone, anywhere you choose. Jesus the great love master can help you. All those that have passed and are receiving the highest teachings can help you and are endeavoring to help you where you are now and at all times. How plainly we see Jesus and all the others always ready to help those who call. You need but make the call and they answer before the call is even finished. They stand and walk beside you every moment. What you must do is to raise your consciousness so that you can see and know that you walk beside them, then you will not falter. They are holding out their hands and saying, "Come unto me and I will give you rest." This does not mean "come after death," this means "come now, just as you are." Raise your consciousness to our consciousness and behold, you stand where we are tonight, above all mortal limitations, abundantly free. Peace, health, love, joy and prosperity are here. These are the fruits of the Spirit, the gifts of God. If we look unto God, no harm can befall us, no evil can come nigh us. If we look to Him wholly, we are healed of our infirmities, in the transcendent name of the law, or Jesus. God is in the midst of you, child of infinite, immortal Spirit. There is not to make you tremble or despair, not to make you fear. From the bosom of the Father you came, the breath of Almighty God created you a living soul. Before Abraham was, you were. Beloved, now are we sons of God, joint heirs with Christ. The same power is in you that is in Jesus. This is called the mantle of the Spirit. With the right concept of this, it is found that there is no decay, no disease, no accident, no death, nothing that can take your life in any way. You can draw this mantle so closely around you that nothing can penetrate it, nothing can touch you. All the destructive agencies or forces ever created by man may be directed at you, yet you will come forth unharmed. If by any chance the outer form should be destroyed, it would immediately return as spiritual in the same form. This is an armor better than any armor plate ever devised by man, and you can use it at all times without money and without price. You can stand forth as you are, the child of the living God. Jesus recognized this, and he could have saved himself the Calvary experience. Had he wished to use his power, his enemies could not have touched him. He saw there was a great spiritual change taking place in his body and saw that, if this was brought about among those he knew and loved, without some outward change, a great many would not recognize the spiritual import but would still cling to the personal. He knew that he had the power to overcome death, and he wished to show those that he loved that they had the same power, so he chose the Calvary way, the way they could see, and seeing, they would believe. He also wished to show that he had so perfected his body that, should his enemies take his life, as they looked upon life, and place his body in the tomb and roll a great stone thereon, the last limitation that man could put upon it, still he, the true self, could roll away the stone and raise his real or spiritual body above all mortal limitations. Jesus could have taken his body and disappeared, but he chose to show that, when the spiritual body is developed, no material accident or condition can destroy it, not even the taking of the life by another. After the crucifixion and ascension, his body was so highly developed spiritually that Jesus was obliged to raise the consciousness of those about him to a plane where they were able to see him, just as we are obliged to raise the consciousness of nearly all those about us tonight. When the women came to the tomb that morning and found the stone rolled away and the grave clothes lying by, even they did not know him until he had raised their consciousness to the plane where they could behold him. Then later, when two were on the road to Emmaus, Jesus drew near and conversed with them, yet they knew him not until he broke bread with them. At that time their consciousness was raised to the plane where they could behold him. Just so, when he appeared to others, he even walked and talked with them, yet they did not recognize him because their consciousness was not functioning on the plane where they could see him. The moment their consciousness did rise or function on the plane with his, they saw him. Then some perceived the spiritual import of actuality. They saw the deep meaning underlying it all. They knew. Yet with all this a great many did not believe in him because they had not yet attained a plane in consciousness where they could see or perceive the underlying spiritual meaning. Then the veil of mystery drawn by man's mortal perception was removed. And the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom. The consciousness was attained that death had been overcome, and that not only death, but all man-made mortal limitations could and would be overcome, by coming up over them or raising our consciousness to the plane on which they can no longer be seen and, therefore, do not exist. If this consciousness is loved and cherished, it will come forth. This was the revelation that came to Jacob as he lay upon the hard stone of materiality. It was revealed to him that that which is gazed upon is brought forth, and his realization of this released him from his material bondage. It was this which prompted him to put spotted sticks in the cows drinking water, thus causing them to bring forth spotted offspring. We can so definitely put forth our ideal into the formless that it is formed direct from the unformed, that which appears invisible to mortal consciousness. The drinking water of the cows but typifies the mirror through which the image held in mind is reflected to the soul, the innermost, and then conceived and brought forth. It is the same with the friends assembled here tonight, only a few of the earnest ones perceive and they go on, unfold, and do the real work of God. Others make a good beginning, but it soon requires too much exertion to surmount the first wall of materiality. They find it much easier to drift with the tide and they drop out. We have all lived in the visible, mortal plane on this earth. In fact, we have never left the earth. We are now invisible only to those that are in mortal consciousness. To those that are on a higher plane of consciousness we are always visible. Every seed idea placed in the soul becomes a conception and is given thought form in mind, later to be experienced in physical form. Ideas of perfection produce perfection. The reverse is equally true. Just as the sun and the earth produce with equal willingness the mighty tree or the frailest flower, when their respective seeds are planted, so spirit and soul respond to man, and that which he desires or that for which he has asked, believing, he receives. Those that have passed from the visible through death are manifesting on the same psychic plane as when they left the body, for the mortal mind functions on the psychic plane. This is the cause of the great psychic realm which lies between the material, or visible, and the true spiritual, and through which all aspiring to the true spiritual must force their way before the spiritual is perceived. In order to perceive the spiritual, we must forge through the psychic directly to God. Death releases the soul only to the psychic plane, and it manifests on the same spiritual plane it was in when the soul was released from the body. The one so passing has not perceived that there is but one spirit, one mind, one body, and that all came forth from this one and must return to it. The spirit sent forth from this one and given a perfect body is as much a part of the one spirit as our arm is a part of our whole body, and is never separated from it any more than any member of our body is a separate part, but is one with the whole body and must be fitly joined with it to make up the whole. So must all spirit or expression be fitly joined together to be complete and perfect. They shall all be gathered together in one place, means that we shall be conscious that we are one expression of the divinity and all from the same source, God. This is the atonement, the at one meant, knowing we are all created in the image and likeness of God, exactly like Him, an image through which He may and can express the ideal He has conceived for us. To be willing that God shall express perfectly through us the highest ideal He has conceived is the meaning of "Not my will, but thine, O God, be done." None can rise above mortal thoughts without doing the will of God, whether he does it consciously or unconsciously. Here the talk dropped for a moment and one of our party asked about the relativity of matter. She went on to say, the real world is substance, the relativity of substance. Let us consider for a moment the five kingdoms, the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, the man, and the God kingdoms. We will begin at the mineral, the lowest. We find every particle of the mineral kingdom expressing the one life, the life of God. The disintegration or division of the particles of the mineral, combined with elements of air and water, has formed soil, every particle still retaining the original life, the life of God. This gives place to the vegetable kingdom, the next higher expression of God to come forth. Then the vegetable, every part of which contains this one life, has taken up a part of this life from the mineral, has increased and multiplied it, and is expressing it one step higher toward the God kingdom. This gives place to the animal, the next higher expression of God. Then the animal, every part of which contains the one life, has taken up a part of this life from the vegetable, has increased and multiplied it, and is expressing one step higher toward the God kingdom. This gives place to the man kingdom, the next higher expression of God. Then the man kingdom, every part of which contains the one life, has taken up a part of this one life from the animal kingdom and, in expressing it one step higher, gives place to the God kingdom, the highest expression through man. When man has attained this kingdom, he recognizes that all have come forth from the one source, that all contain the one life, the life of God, and he has gained the mastery over all material things. But we need not pause here, for all is progression. When he arrives here he will find there are new worlds still to conquer. Now we come to the place where we recognize that all space or magnitude contains the one life, the life of God, that all is from the one source and substance. Then all substance becomes relative or related, does it not? Here the talk ended, the dinner was finished, and the room was cleared of tables and chairs. There followed a time of frolic and fun, including dance and song with the music furnished by the invisible choir, and all enjoyed a good time together. The evening finally ended in music and song, the invisible choir became visible, walked among those assembled, and at times floated just above their heads. The final ending was one outburst of music, song, and laughter, with all participating. Taken altogether, it was the most impressive scene that we ever witnessed. We were told that if we would become quiet, we could hear the music at all times, but it is only on an occasion like this that the chorus accompanies the music. We tried this a number of times afterward and found that we could hear the music. It was always low and beautifully sweet, but it never had the glad free ring of that one evening unless there were a number of the masters congregated. We were told that this music is what has been called the angel choir. They call it the symphony of souls in accord. We stopped in this village 3 days and during that time saw a great deal of our friends. The evening of the third day they bade us goodbye and, saying they would meet us at our winder quarters, disappeared.